It is said that a lie repeated 1,000 times becomes the truth, and there is something to this. Often repeated false information related to nutrition can effectively stick in our memory to the point that we start to believe it. And while some of this information has little or no effect on our health or approach to nutrition, others can make our lives miserable if we adhere to them. Let's briefly debunk some of these pseudo-facts. One of my favorite myths is that gluten is toxic and kills people. For those who are unaware, gluten is simply a mixture of proteins found in various grains. It is this ingredient that gives products the right elasticity, resilience, and viscosity. It is true that it does not bring anything particularly good besides its technological function. However, this does not mean that it is harmful to everyone. It is simply neutral. What can be criticized is that the consumption of gluten by some people can cause certain negative health effects. But this is only because our bodies have certain defects and become hypersensitive to gluten. It is like saying that strawberries are harmful because part of the population is allergic to them and various ailments appear after consuming them. Of course, this is absurd. Recommendations to avoid gluten mainly apply to people with celiac disease, a genetically determined autoimmune condition in which gluten triggers an acute immune response. In short, in people with celiac disease, abnormally large amounts of certain molecules are produced, which bind to digested gluten, resulting in an exacerbated immune reaction and the development of a chronic inflammatory state. This leads to a range of health problems. To be clear, gluten does not cause celiac disease. Rather, people with this genetic condition are simply sensitive to this ingredient. It is also said that, for example, removing gluten from the diet can improve the health of people with autism. This is partially true, although it is not a rule. Again, it is not gluten that causes autism, but people with this condition may be sensitive to this ingredient in some way. Of course, on the internet we can find opinions of many people who advocate a gluten-free diet because it has improved their overall health. Indeed, this effect is possible, but it does not result from removing gluten, but rather it results from eliminating a range of products from the diet that are simply considered unhealthy, such as fast food, confectionery, or products based on refined wheat flour. There is also an interesting myth that milk is responsible for an overproduction of mucus. Ignoring other health-related issues with milk, whether it is a good or bad product, I would like to focus on this one aspect and explain it. Mucus itself is a natural substance that covers the mucous membranes of our body, including the respiratory and digestive tracts, protecting these areas from chemical, thermal, and mechanical damage. But some people are convinced that milk causes an overproduction of mucus. However, this is a misconception. To explain this, we have the phenomenon of flocculation. Simply put, due to its physiochemical properties, specifically that milk is an emulsion of fat droplets in water, when it combines with our saliva, it can lead to an increase in the viscosity of the mucus in the digestive tract. This increased viscosity is what some people may perceive as an increase in mucus production. However, the amount of mucus remains the same, it just becomes more viscous. Additionally, the speed and size of these complexes vary from person to person, meaning that for some people the process is more intense than for others. This explains why some people may experience this perceived mucus production while others do not. When it comes to excessive mucus production, the phenomenon has its specific causes, which do not include consuming milk. For example, excessive mucus production can be caused by allergic reactions, gastroesophageal reflux, asthma, bacterial infections, or diseases such as chronic bronchitis, pneumonia, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Interestingly, scientists conducted a study to verify the aforementioned perception of excessive mucus production in people who consume milk. For this purpose, people who declared feeling mucus were given a plant-based drink, telling them it was cow's milk. It turned out that people who consumed this product reported feeling an overproduction of mucus. This shows how deeply the discussed belief has taken root in the minds of some people. There are many nutrition myths, one of which is that fruit juices are healthy and should be consumed. While fruits in moderate amounts can be beneficial, the juice obtained from them may not be, especially when consumed in large quantities and for an extended period of time. Firstly, this is because most of the vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants from the fruits remain in the pulp and do not make into the juice. For example, apple juice may have up to 30 times fewer phenolic compounds than fresh apples. This is because processes such as grinding the fruit tissue, pectin extraction, and clarification destroy these compounds. Especially commercially available fruit juices are of little value because they are deprived of many beneficial compounds. Furthermore, fruit juices are a source of sugar. It does not matter that it is natural sugar. In fact, the sugar that ends up in our sugar basin is also natural, such as that obtained from beets. In any case, few people know that most fruit juices contain the same amount of sugar as popular soft drinks. In 100 milliliters, we typically have about 10 grams of sugar, which equates to 4 to 5 teaspoons of sugar in one glass. Of course, fruit juices may have some benefits for certain people. Much depends on an individual's nutrition status. In the case of people with poor nutrition, juices can provide deficient nutrients and thus work beneficially. For example, 100 milliliters of orange juice contains 200 milligrams of potassium. If you are deficient in potassium, orange juice can partially make up for this deficiency. If I have already discussed the topic of sugar, then it is now time to address the nutrition myth that was created by marketers. I think many of you have heard that cane sugar or brown sugar is healthier than regular white sugar. After all, brown color is associated better than white. And this is likely because the brown color is associated with whole grain products, which are healthier than their light counterparts based on white wheat flour. However, this rule does not apply to sugar. Sugar is sugar. Brown sugar does not contain any additional beneficial compounds that would be present in significant amounts. The only certain difference may be in taste, however, that's it. If any of you still prefer to pay 2 or even 3 times more for cane sugar without getting any health benefits in return, I must admit that this nutrition myth is quite expensive, although, of course, I'm not looking into anyone's wallet. Similar situations arise when it comes to salt, specifically the alleged superiority of Himalayan salt over other types. It is advertised as a source of additional minerals, but let's look at the readily available facts. Himalayan salt, just like regular kitchen salt, contains around 97% chloride sodium, so we are left with only 3% that could be filled with other elements. Even if we were to put magnesium, iron, or zinc in those 3%, it would still be trace amounts that would have no significance to our health. It is like throwing 1 grain of rice into a bag of buckwheat and saying that I will make a buckwheat rice dish out of it. In any case, hats off to the marketers who can sell essentially the same product, only 4 times more expensive. Let's now move on to the next point while still staying with salt. It is usually said that salt is harmful. It even got the nickname White Death. While this is true that consuming it in excessive amounts can cause various health problems, it is not as bad as it is portrayed. For example, salt is responsible for the proper regulation of the water electrolyte balance. Additionally, the sodium present in it participates in the conduction of nerve impulses and muscle contractions. As an interesting fact, I will also mention that an extremely low level of sodium in the body can even increase the risk of developing cardiovascular diseases and insulin resistance. One of the most common misconceptions about nutrition is that it is optimal to eat 5 meals a day to increase metabolism, speed up weight loss, or regulate blood sugar levels. However, no scientific studies have proven that 5 meals are better than 3 or even 2. Of course, in certain situations it may be better to divide the daily ration into more meals, such as when dealing with digestive problems and not wanting to overburden the stomach. But as a general rule, there is no necessity to eat 5 meals a day. It is a myth. It is a common misconception that fats are bad for your health. This likely stems from the fact that fats are high in calories. This is true. Fat provides more than double the amount of calories than protein and carbohydrates. However, this doesn't mean that fat makes you gain weight. In fact, it is the opposite. Fat provides a longer feeling of satiety, which helps maintain a healthy weight. Many people also believe that fat causes fatty liver. However, aside from the similarity in words, there is no other sensible connection. In reality, it is the consumption of too many carbohydrates, especially simple sugars, that leads to fatty liver. This is because sugar is converted to fat in our bodies. It should be noted that trans fats, a type of fat created through technological processing, such as hardening vegetable oils to make margarine, are harmful. However, there are many natural fats that have a very beneficial effect on our health. Many people perceive frozen vegetables and fruits as being of much less value than their fresh counterparts when it comes to nutrition. In reality, freezing is an effective method of preserving food not only in terms of their edibility, but also in terms of preserving their nutritional value. Numerous studies have shown that frozen vegetables and fruits do not differ in terms of their content of individual nutrients compared to fresh products. In fact, it has even been found that frozen products can sometimes have higher levels of certain compounds, such as antioxidants. Of course, when it is in season, it is always best to use fresh produce. However, when autumn or winter comes, reaching for frozen vegetables and fruits can be a very good solution, and they should not be seen as of little value. One of the most common misconceptions is that eggs are unhealthy because they contain cholesterol and cause atherosclerosis. However, many studies have conclusively shown that regular consumption of eggs by healthy individuals does not affect the lipid profile of the blood, meaning that it does not, for example, increase the cholesterol level in the blood. Furthermore, scientists have confirmed that even relatively large amounts of eggs in the diet are not associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular diseases. Moreover, cholesterol itself is not a harmful component. I will discuss this further in a separate video dedicated to cholesterol. When discussing nutrition myths, it is impossible not to mention the claim that coffee supposedly depletes magnesium. However, researchers have repeatedly confirmed that consuming coffee does not lead to significant losses of magnesium. Interestingly, it can be said that coffee provides more magnesium than it is lost when drinking it. Therefore, the balance may even be positive, although it is such a marginal scale that it can be ignored. So the question is, where do muscle cramps including eyelid twitching come from if not from magnesium depletion caused by coffee? The truth is that drinking coffee can cause such side effects, but it is not related to magnesium. The explanation of this fact is as follows. The caffeine present in coffee causes the release of calcium ions in muscle cells, which in turn stimulates the muscles to contract. This is why, for example, eyelid twitching may appear. Additionally, caffeine stimulates the nervous system, which can also be the cause of muscle cramps, but it has nothing to do with magnesium. A widely spread dietary myth is that hot spices cause stomach ulcers. In reality, there is no connection between their consumption and ulcers. At most, hot spices can exacerbate the symptoms of peptic ulcer disease in some people, but they never cause it. One could even say that at the cellular level, hot spices could have some therapeutic effect. For example, chili pepper and specifically the capsaicin it contains can inhibit gastric acid secretion, stimulate the release of protective mucus, and increase blood flow in the gastric mucosa, which helps in healing ulcers. Many people still believe that spinach is a good source of iron, but this is not true. In 100 grams of spinach, there is only about 1 milligram of iron. As a reference point, the daily requirement for iron is 10 milligrams for men and 18 milligrams for women. If we take into account other vegetables, for example kale, it contains about 1.5 milligrams of iron, which is about 50% more. It is also important to note that spinach contains oxalates, which bind to iron and inhibit its absorption. Therefore, not only is there not a lot of iron in spinach, but it has also low bioavailability. Although spinach is generally a healthy product and should be included in one's diet, treating it as a remedy for anemia can be disappointing. The fact that spinach has been seen for decades as a very good source of iron is an example of a misconception. A long time ago, in one of the scientific publications, the author made a mistake and put a comma in the wrong place when providing numerical data. When it comes to iron, I must also mention beets. It is commonly believed that beets can cure anemia, specifically iron deficiency anemia. However, this statement should be considered a myth, although I must admit there is a grain of truth to it. The good news is that beets contain relatively large amounts of copper and folic acid, which are involved in blood formation. This makes them worth having in your diet as they can be helpful for people with anemia. The bad news is that in order to cure anemia, the main task is to provide large amounts of well-absorbed iron. It is the lack of this element that causes anemia. And there is even less iron in beets than in spinach, and it is not characterized by a very good bioavailability. Therefore, it cannot be said that beets cure anemia, as they do not contain significant amounts of iron, which is the key element here. Nevertheless, they can help to a small extent, but only if we provide the aforementioned iron. Another myth related to vegetables is that potatoes are thought to be fattening. In fact, potatoes are low in calories. 100 grams of potatoes provide only 80 kilocalories. For comparison, one bag of rice of the same mass of 100 grams is about 340 kilocalories. Probably the aforementioned belief comes from the fact that potatoes are very often served with fatty and viscous sauces that increase the caloric value of the dish. In addition, caloric dishes and products are prepared from potatoes, such as fried potato pancakes, fries, or potato chips. However, potatoes themselves, for example boiled, do not provide a large amount of energy. Furthermore, they have a high satiety index. Reading about health in many places, we may also come across the information that cottage cheese is a very good source of calcium. However, I must also say here that this is not true. In fact, in 100 grams of such cheese, there are approximately 90 milligrams of calcium. For example, the same amount of natural yogurt contains twice as much of this component. On the other hand, yellow cheese contains 8 to 10 times more calcium than cottage cheese. Furthermore, it is worth mentioning that cottage cheese compared to yellow cheese has a much worse calcium to phosphorus ratio. I hope I have dispelled some of the myths we encounter on a daily basis. The problem is that there are many more. I have a request for you to share in the comments section below any other myths you have heard so that we can verify them together. I also encourage you to watch another video on my channel about flaxseed. To watch it, just click on the thumbnail that appeared on the screen. That's all from me today. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you next time.